All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to look at William Butler Yeats today, a few of his poems, moving now into the 20th century. We concluded last class with Heart of Darkness, looking at the end of the Victorian era. The poet Yeats is born in the midst of that. He's born in 1865 and dies in 1939, so right on the cusp of the Second World War. And so he's a transitional poet in the sense of, just think of his context. We've gone from the height of the British Empire under Victoria and the colonialism that ensues in what I described as the scramble for Africa in 1870. And also within that, then the First World War, 1914 to 1918. And towards the end of Yeats' life, the rise of Nazi Germany. So the Second World War is declared in 1939 after Hitler's aggression and so forth. So a lot of events going on in the background. I mean, this isn't a history class, so I don't spend too much time on that, but I do think we need to have in mind what is happening in the author's life while he's writing his poetry, in this case, just to give a sense of what he's talking about, particularly when poetry is not necessarily explicit in its details, but is rather making generalizations and expressing them in poetic form and through symbol. And Yeats is particularly so a symbolic poet. He writes a great deal of very elusive but also rather obscure lines. And Yeats is influenced by poets that we've already looked at in the course, namely the Romantic poets, Keats and Wordsworth, Blake, perhaps Blake more than the others in certain respects. Blake, you can see, not that we covered this in the class, but Blake in his longer poems effectively creates his own mythology. And Yeats does likewise. He has his own private language, if you will. And it's what makes his poetry challenging as you read it. The more you read it, the more you think he has terms that he means certain things by, which are not commonly understood. So thus far, we haven't really gone there in the sense of poets creating their own terminology, with the exception of Blake. And in Blake's case, we didn't actually read his major poems to be acquainted with the terms that he uses there. We've largely found poets that inherited the classical mythology and still made reference to those terms. You know, Aphrodite or Venus would still be referred to by Milton, the goddess of love, and we'll keep on using those terms to refer to love in a particular form. The modern poets will, when I say modern, those of the modernist movement, and Yeats is one of those poets, along with T.S. Eliot and others, who will be described as modernist poets, will break from the past to some degree. Now, I don't want to throw Eliot in this because he sees himself as a classicist and a continuation of the tradition. But we do start to note in the, not just in the poets, but in the thinkers of the day, an explicit break from the past. And I think it's concurrent with the rise of the human sciences and a belief in the power of human learning, humane learning, detached from tradition, from the past, from Christianity explicitly. So I've said already in the class, I believe, that the university is a medieval institution. It's a Christian institution at that. And there's a unity of knowledge in that, connected with the 7 liberal arts, which are all under theology, which is the queen of the sciences. There's the queen of the sciences, theology, and then she has her subjects, and her subjects are the 7 liberal arts, and there are 3 that are associated with the word, grammar, logic, rhetoric, and there are 4 that are associated with number, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And so you can either understand reality through words or understand reality through numbers, and that hasn't changed. If you're a science person, then you tend to understand things and to be able to think numerically. If you're an artistic person, you tend to think through words, through language, expressing that way. But both of them really are understanding reality in a particular way. And the understanding of the medieval period is that theology is the queen of all of these different ways of knowing. Well, come the Enlightenment and what follows in the university, the queen is decapitated. She's not reigning in the universities anymore. And with that comes the question, which I have an answer for, which is what is going to unify the different areas of knowledge? And the answer is there is no unity. So the university moves in the direction of being a multiversity. There are many ways of knowing. There are many fields of knowing, but they're not unified in any particular way. I'm at a Christian university, you're at a Christian university, we do talk about the integration of faith and learning. So there's a unity, and there's a way in which these things are to be integrated. Is that the case? I mean, whether I'm effective or not is a different question. The question is, am I trying to unify? That question of unifying the various ways of knowing, so let's say the 7 paths of the liberal arts curriculum, so the arts and the sciences, if you will, is that the explicit aim or even the implicit aim of the universities, the public universities in our day? And the answer is no. It's flat no. It's specialism pursued ad infinitum in minutia, and there's nothing that holds it all together anymore. And so that creates a sort of diversity. But diversity in our day gets a lot of good publicity. What's the difference between diversity and discord? What's the difference between diversity and chaos? What's the difference between diversity and anarchy? I'm not saying there is no difference. I'm saying tell me what the difference is. Diversity is not a way of inclusion. It's actually a way of division. Or if it is a way of inclusion, it's a way of including truth and falsehood under one umbrella, as if there were no distinction besides 2 sides of the same coin. Well, that's what I described as pantheism. Good and evil are just words that we use to describe things, but there's no essential difference between good and evil. Well, that's what we saw in Heart of Darkness, right? The descent of the European mind, remember Mr. Kurtz was the finest flower, or he represented European culture in its essence in Conrad's novella. And Conrad was pretty categoric, although I think he when I say categoric, he was ambiguous because he wanted us to see it from the inside, not as a critic of the system, but as somebody thinking within the system, but presenting it in such terms that we would be critical of what was going on. He's making us critical of colonialism. Some critics, as I said, have said it is a colonialist text. And my response to them is, if that's so, then why are so many films based on Heart of Darkness critical of colonialism? Because they recognize that so is Conrad. Just like Apocalypse Now, it's critical of the Vietnam War. That's what it is. It's a protest film in many ways. Well, Mr. Yeats is wading into the middle of that, and his own context is interesting here. He isn't a Protestant, Anglican, or English speaker by background, but he's an Irishman. So he's in a sense, he's like Jonathan Swift. And there's a long tradition in Irish letters of people writing in English who are nonetheless sympathetic with the cause of Irish nationalism. But there is no Irish nation when Yeats is born. And let me say a little bit about nationalism here. Nationalism, I mean, our own Prime Minister talks about Canada being a post-national entity, whatever that means. It's a term that he's used. Nationalism as such and the rise of the nation state is a phenomena of the Romantic period. There are countries that we identify before and after with the same thing, but really the nationalization of concerns comes in this period we call the Romantic period. Beginning of the 19th century. What do I mean by that then? Well, there are institutions that are there to bind the national identity together. And among other things, we will note things like the oversight over health, welfare, and education in this period. So we get a public school system for the first time, coming in the mid or early 19th century, sometimes a little bit later. Canada never existed without it, at least as a nation. Remember, Canada comes into existence as a nation in 1867 as a self-governing institution, in a sense. That's right? I think you know that. Anyway, now you do. And with that, we get a sense of a national health agency, a national education system, a national social welfare agency, etc. Well, in Canada, like in many countries, it's provincially directed. So there's sort of general rules from the top at the federal system, and at the state or the provincial level, that's where things are actually directed, and the specifics are put into practice. But still, the whole point here is that this is now uploaded to the state, thinking that the state is and the nation is best suited to implement the public good. And we get national anthems and we get national flags. These arise with the Romantic movement. The Romantic movement, if you recall, is marked by a love of nature and a love of feeling and a belief in the power of the imagination to connect all of us. Remember Wordsworth said this? We saw the same with Blake, the idea of the imagination being this unifying faculty. But what we note also in this period is, as I say, the rise of the nation state. And the nation states are just a form of tribalism, I will say, on a grander scale. And the consequence of that tribalism is immediately colonialism. It's nations now understanding themselves as having a unifying consciousness, acting in unison to further the interests of their people. And their people, because of Darwinism, are identified with particular races. And so we get a new sense of racism that emerges after the abolition of the slave trade. But now it's connected with a national identity. And the problem with this, which is a problem I've talked about repeatedly on the course, is there a sense of common human nature in the midst of all this? What happens to that? It's clear in the Christian university, because theology is the queen of the sciences, and God himself is a man, Jesus Christ, the God-man, that our unity will be in him. The truth will be in him. In him all things will hold together. Colossians 1:15. A national pursuit of these things will be motivated by something other than the unity of Christ and his kingdom. It will be motivated by national self-interest, which is declared to be autonomous. And the result of that, which we're going to read Yeats' poetry catalogues, among other things, is the rise, first of all, of the Irish nation. We'll read a poem that describes exactly that. It's called Easter 1916. You remember just a little bit about Ireland. Ireland was, as we saw when we looked at Swift and Modest Proposal, effectively a vassal state of the United Kingdom since the time of Oliver Cromwell, among other things, during the period in which Milton was writing, the English Revolutionary War. Catholic Ireland was used by the Spanish as a sort of a front to attack Cromwell's Republican government and its Protestant religion. And so Cromwell went into Ireland, just as he went to Scotland, to crush rebellions around his borders to try and preserve the Republic from its threats, but left a legacy of English aristocrats governing the country. And Yeats is a Protestant English speaker, and he writes poetry in English. But in many ways, we've already seen, at least very briefly from looking at Swift, there's a sense of the Protestant aristocrats not necessarily governing in the best interests of their subjects. A sort of a feudalism holds on. There's no different in Catholic countries, by the way. This isn't a Protestant distinctive. In Canada, the seigneurial system in Lower Canada, which we now call Quebec, that was very much a feudal system. You have a local farmer who rules that way. It's very much the same system, whether it's Catholic or Protestant, sort of feudalism. Not much different from that. But Yeats comes at the time, and he becomes interesting as a poet really in the 20th century. So I said he was born in 1865. As a poet, he takes interest for us when he comes to the 20th century. So he's a mature adult. Well, I shouldn't judge his maturity, but he's in his 30s, 40s by the time he is writing his great poetry. And the first one I'm going to look at here is one, as I said, called Easter 1916. Oh, can I get this to work? It's probably cooled off by now. Oh, no, there we go. So I'll see if I can. Oh, it's there on the screen. Okay. So the context here is an uprising, which was suppressed bloodily. The British troops came in and suppressed it with violence, shot some of the instigators of the rebellion. And yet Yeats commemorates this incident and suggests that this is the beginning. It's a Christian, I think it's Tertullian, says the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. He presents it in rather different terms. He sees that the blood of these martyrs is the seed of the nation of Ireland. And that's what this is described as. So let me come to that. And then I'll move to a second poem called The Second Coming, in which he will talk about what I said right at the outset, this sense of that for all of the identity that comes with, let's say, the Irish nation, there's still a sense of things falling apart and the diversity of the various nations not having anything holding them together, and are thereby being inherently divisive and prone towards war, without any means of peace, because there's no common human nature. The common humanity is being denied. And this is at the same time, one final backdrop, the rise of the eugenics movement is coterminous with this, where they're trying to perfect human nature through medical science. And doing experiments on biology, doing experiments on orphans, doing experiments on, it's usually on orphans, interestingly, because nobody's going to speak on their behalf. But it will also be particularly exercised on races that are deemed inferior. It's extraordinary. Because, of course, the eugenics movement involves the perfection of the species, and if you have various nations from different origins, of different skin color or religious background, whatever, the question is, if it's survival of the fittest, well, which one is the fittest? And how will you determine who's the fittest other than through a fight? And that is how nature is perceived. The Victorians are not like the Romantics that see nature as this peaceful, serene, inclusive, divine thing. They see it as red in tooth and claw with ravin. That's Tennyson's phrase. So they see a war within nature, a pitiless war without ethics. The good guy doesn't win in nature. The strongest wins. Those who are fit to survive win. So with that, ethics is then led by a view of nature in which the moral nature of humanity has been denied, because the moral nature of humanity, which was recognized in the ancient pagan world, was fully understood in the person of Jesus Christ in the medieval period. So that being a good person meant laying down your life for others, not taking others' lives to exalt yourself. It's a very different ethics. And so when Tennyson, in his Lady of Shalott, talks about this sense of the past being the context for the British Empire, and wishing that we had those noble knights of old living in our midst, he doesn't believe in what unified them, which is Christ. He realizes we need the ethics of the knight, but we have no more knights. And that's even in the British Empire where they knight people. The queen or king taps them on the shoulder and dubs them knights. So now they're Sir so-and-so. Yes, but do the sirs and the madams who are knighted, do they believe in Jesus? Or just in the ideal of knighthood and aristocracy? And if aristocracy, do the aristocrats believe there's a unifying human nature that unites the people that are on the other side of the front? So in terms of a fight, do you let the person that you've hit to the ground stand up again and fight? Or when they get down, do you pound them on the ground and you keep hitting them? Because there are no rules that govern the combat. Marquess of Queensberry rules, right? Which is, there are no rules. Punch. So, we don't shake hands before or after. There's no tapping of the gloves. It's as soon as I can get you when your guard's down, I hit you, because it's survival of the fittest. Was there a comment? No. Yeats, Easter 1916. I'm going to read this. In some ways, it's the least compelling of the poems I'm going to look at, but it's interesting historically. It catalogs the rise of the nation state of what is called the Republic of Ireland. And it's important in the light of that, and also for the rise of a nation. And there are other nations that arise, by the way. And at the end of the First World War, something called the League of Nations was instituted by the president of the time, Woodrow Wilson, and the right of autonomy for different nation states was declared. And this was a way of preventing another world war. It caused it. It didn't prevent it, because nothing united the nations. And then we created the UN, which would unite the nations, and it didn't do it either, by the way. Again, there's nothing that unites the United Nations, aside from techniques and meeting together and talking. But what unites humanity, really? That's the question. And without Christ, I think there is nothing, myself. But that's a broader topic of discussion. But Yeats, Easter 1916. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces, from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head, or polite, meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite, meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn. All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Motley is what a fool wears, by the way. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers when young and beautiful she rode to harriers? This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. This other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. This other man, now he's mentioned 4, this other man I had dreamt a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart, yet I numbered him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim, and a horse plashes within it. The long-legged moorhens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part, our part to murmur name upon name, as a mother names her children when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse. MacDonough and McBride and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. Thus ends the 4-stanza poem. I was taught this poem in grade 3. Can you imagine what I thought in grade 3? I thought, this is totally obscure. The woman was Irish, of course, and she just loved the poem. Teacher in the public school system. This is not a grade 3 poem. Anyway, but I remember the word plashes. Now, that's a new word. It is a new word. I had no idea what it meant, other than it sounds like splashes, which is probably close to what it meant. But you can see that at the outset he names, so there's a context, 18th century houses, he's in Dublin. Very much of a Georgian city, same as Edinburgh, same as Newcastle, same as various places. They've been enriched by to some degree, the developments of the Enlightenment. A great deal of money has been spent. So there are Georgian houses in these older cities, not here in Canada. Canada comes after. We don't have that. But if you go to Dublin or Edinburgh or Newcastle or various cities in Europe, a lot of their architecture comes from the 18th century. Grand stuff, but gray, and the life that they live there is seemingly meaningless. And they have polite, meaningless words. They don't really say anything of significance. And they feel like fools. They live where motley is worn. But there's a transformation that comes. And it comes, note that there's a refrain here. A terrible beauty is born. He keeps saying that, although he suggests, and he does that in a way that sounds a lot like Tennyson. the repetition of lines. There's a change in that, and that's where the stone's in the midst of it all. What exactly is the stone? Is the stone a reference to Christ, the rock? I don't think so. But you could think it was. Probably some other symbol. Yeats, by the way, although his background is Protestant, indulged in mysticism and the occult, seances and so forth, communing with the dead. And as I say, created his own private mythology here. But that, the people that were meaningless are referred to here in various forms, and they have no names in the second stanza. To have a name is to have an identity. A person without a name, we would say, is just a number. And you can identify people by names of number. You can have a digital identity. Is your digital identity, which is encapsulated in a number, going to encapsulate the entirety of what you will hold in a name? You have a family name, you have a personal name. In some Christian countries, you have a Christian name. So Saul becomes Paul. Peter, or Cephas becomes Peter, and so forth. Actually, his name was Simon, pardon me. Simon, which means a reed. He used to bend and break, and then he becomes the rock. He gets renamed. It's a lot of significance that lies in names in Scripture, and person's identity with that. And yet he doesn't identify himself as Peter. He identifies himself as an apostle of Jesus Christ. That's his identity. That's what unifies him with everybody else. So he's not saying my name, Peter, is insignificant. After all, even Jesus saw significance in it, but he identifies himself in terms of who he is in relation to him. That unity has been lost, but still the idea of a name giving your identity is very important. As I say, as we enter the age of digital ID, there's threats to human identity there, even through the power of technology, which makes life a lot easier and a lot less personal. Anyway, the second stanza talks about four people here. There's a woman spending goodwill, a man who kept a school, a third who seemed like a poet, his helper and friend of good nature, and a fourth who's a drunken, vainglorious lout. Those who know a bit about Yeats will be able to identify exactly who he's talking about here. But here, the important thing for the poem is they're not named. And in that sense, they're not significant. They just utter dry, meaningless words, trite, meaningless words. But they are transformed utterly. What transforms them? Some sort of natural evolution connected with nature here. The horse hoof slides on the brim, a horse plashes within it, the long-legged moorhens dive. They live minute by minute, the stone's in the midst of all, and yet it's time. There's a sense of apocalypse, of revelation. Something has come about that it was not seen before, and now it is seen. But it's seen through their actions. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That's heaven part. Our part is to murmur name upon name, and he will murmur them at the end. And whose names are they? McDonough and McBride and Connolly and Pierce. Family names identified with people some of whom were shot on Sunday, Bloody Sunday. Comes a U2 song. You know it. And if you remember, Bono says this is not a rebel song. He starts to make Christian connections to all this, which I'm not sure solves the problem. But at any rate, now wherever green is worn are changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. So it's no longer a sign of folly, of being a fool to wear green. It's a symbol of an identity with a name. They become who they are. So their loss of life gave life to the Irish nation. Now, this move for national identity had been afoot for some years in Ireland, and was, as I say, suppressed in 1916. I don't want to excuse it, but this is the context of war. You don't really want a nation state to come arise on your doorstep when you're fighting a battle with the Germans. But once the World War was over, then it does happen. The British give the Irish their own national identity, which they have now to this day. And it's about 100 years old, and then some. So that's the first poem. Comments or questions about it? Okay. Now I want to go to the second poem. This is a famous poem. It's called The Second Coming. Now, because it's the second coming, you would immediately associate it, just as Yeats would, and his entire audience would, with the second coming of Christ. Right? I mean, that's the immediate association of anybody in the Western world, or anywhere in the world where Christianity has had any sort of roots. The second coming is associated with exactly that. The first coming is the incarnation at Christmas. The second coming with his return to judge the living and the dead, mentioned in Scripture, right? Associated with in the Bible with the book of Revelation, the apocalypse. The way the word apocalypse, by the way, is associated with calamity, but really the word simply means that you are now revealing what was hidden. Before it was hidden, and now it's come out from being hidden. Calypso is to be hidden. Remember the nymph in the Odyssey? Her name was Calypso. She hid Odysseus. We couldn't see him. Nobody knew where he was. He was incognito, as if even though he would have lived eternally, he would not have been. Nobody back home knew where he was. He was living a life of eternal infamy. You had no fame. You had no one who knew and would carry on his name among the living. He would live, but he didn't want to live that sort of life. Anyway, Calypso is hidden. Apocalypse, it's popped out. Now it's visible. Same with Revelation. We associate with calamity, but calamity is just a secondary feature of apocalyptic. It's a genre of literature, by the way, in Scripture. The last book 7 and onward, or chapter 7 in Daniel, is apocalyptic literature. So is Zechariah. Very difficult, very symbolic type of writing. Yeats calls it the second coming. And he makes reference, and there's a line in here, Things Fall Apart, which was mentioned by none other than Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian novelist. That's the name of his novel. So he's engaging as a Nigerian, an African poet, with a poem by Yeats. So again, there's a continuity. That writers read other writers, they engage with it, they may disagree with them profoundly, but they're still influenced by it. This is, again, one of the what you get when you read great literature is a sense of a conversation that's going on, a dialogue. It might be disagreement, but it doesn't matter. The grounds of disagreement are still, in a sense, respectful. As I say, without the unity of the university holding those together, that sense of respect and sense of dialogue starts to disappear. It becomes divisive and fractious. That's Yeats's opinion. That's how I introduce it, but that's Yeats's opinion. He gets a sense here. Let me just read the poem. Turning and turning in the widening gyre. You know what I mean by a gyre? A gyre is there's a gyroscope. It's a cycle, like a falcon. When it, you've seen them, maybe you haven't seen them, but birds, they circle in the air, And a falcon will circle, and it goes ever higher and wider circles, because it lets the air take it up. And it goes higher and higher up by turning its wings a little bit, just tilting it just a bit, and that allows the wind to push it up, and it just pushes it up, and it goes around and around. It takes a long time for the circle to complete. And the higher they get, the wider the circle has to go. And so Yeats uses this image of a falcon going up in its gyre as a symbol of what's happening to his culture. It's getting broader and broader and going up and up and up, but where's the center now? What unites this? Is it so far apart? Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Anyone who has any Christian vocabulary recognizes the Christian references throughout. I mean, some of it is very explicit. But the connection of those Christian ideas with other ideas like the Spiritus Mundi. What is the Spiritus Mundi? The spirit of the world. The munda is the from which you get mundane. The spirit of the earth, the spirit of the age. Not the age here, but the spirit of worldliness. Troubles my sight. And there's a sense then of doom and gloom. We see in the sands of the desert a shape with lion body and the head of a man. What was that? Lion body and the head of a man. Think of where you might have seen that. Egypt? What do we call that? Isn't that the Sphinx? Yeah. Think of the tragedy that we read back in Oedipus that was destroying the city of Thebes. The Sphinx. And there's a riddle connected with the Sphinx. And the riddle, the Sphinx tells a riddle. And what's the riddle? Do you remember the riddle? I'll tell you the riddle, and maybe you can tell me the answer to the riddle. What goes on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs at night? What's the answer to the riddle? A man. Babies go crawling. At the noon, in the middle of their life, they walk on 2 feet. At the end of their life, they go around with a cane to keep them upright. That's the riddle. Nobody can solve the Sphinx's riddle. The Sphinx is plaguing the city of Thebes and destroying it. Oedipus comes along and solves the riddle. The Sphinx goes away, and the central figure then becomes not the Sphinx, destructive, but Oedipus, whose life represents that of mankind in the whole story. He is a representative man, because as a baby, he was not supposed to be born. His parents tried to keep him from being born, if you recall. Because it was prophesied that he would marry his mother and kill his father. And his mother and father don't want this. So they give him to a herdsman and say, go expose him in the wilderness, let him die. So this doesn't happen. Unfortunately, the herdsman takes pity on the baby, gives it to somebody else. He's brought up in another country, doesn't know who he is, eventually fulfills the prophecy, etc. And ends the play having blinded himself, going out with a cane. It's a tragedy. It's about human life. It's about the lot of mankind and the role of the gods, the fates, in determining what we thought we were in charge of. Right, it was fated that this happened. His parents sought to avoid it. He sought to avoid it. Why? Because he wanted to do the right thing. He couldn't do the right thing. Yeats uses that image right in the midst of a poem in the 20th century, written in 1921, I believe. I think I saw that at the bottom of the page there. After the First World War is over, League of Nations has arisen. He's written his poem, Easter 1916, and the Republic of Ireland now exists. But he still has a sense that there is a unity that's been lost. In the name of all this identity and the diverse nations, something is lacking, and what is lacking is the unity. The center cannot hold, things fall apart. Chaos. Entropy. You know what the word entropy means? It's a natural process of things falling apart. It's the consequence of, to my mind, sin. In terms of genetics, it comes through copying mistakes. Each generation passes on its genetic inheritance to its others, to its successors, but a weaker creature, not a stronger one, ensues. We have more diseases, more deformities, more problems. It suggests not that mankind is getting better and better, but rather the opposite. Less healthy. That doesn't fit well with the idea of evolution. So we're not going to talk about that. So then how do you fix that problem? Well, then you do it through eugenics. You root out the copying mistakes. So those who are handicapped, don't let you sterilize them. Don't let them have children. Why? Because now the national identity is going to be working for everybody, and working everybody means sacrificing some who are not fit to live, the unworthy forms of life. Judged by the nation state acting in the national interest for the sake of what? The nation which is connected to the bloodline. Deeply problematic. Anyway, he calls this mere anarchy. And he goes on further and says, everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned, and worst of all, the best lack all conviction. Isn't this fascinating? So his analysis here is that the elite, the aristocrats, have no principles that they will stand by. But the worst are full of passion and intensity. There is a serious problem. In Plato's day, the aristocrats, he posited that they would be ruled by their reason. They would do the right thing because they were convinced of the truth of the ideas. In the universities, they would be committed to the idea that Jesus Christ united all things and all people, and they would be dedicated to serving their neighbor, loving their enemy, etc. That was not just an ideal, it was an example. What does an aristocrat do that lacks that conviction? He acts out of self-interest. He exploits. He is what we described in Heart of Darkness. The worst are full of passionate intensity. They're moved by their guts. C.S. Lewis describes it in 1943 in a series of lectures. He calls it The Abolition of Man. If you're with me in a couple of years, we'll probably read that together. great work. You can read it before then. 1943, The Abolition of Man, 3 chapters. It's about education. It says that we no longer teach virtue. It's been gutted out of the public system. What results? Passionate intensity, but no conviction. And he sees this in apocalyptic terms. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming. But what is the second coming? It's not a reference to Christ here. It is a reference to a rough beast slouching. Its hour come around at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Now Christ came not slouching, but announced by angels. The second coming is a rough beast that is pitiless and is going to destroy man. So he sees it in the worst sense of apocalyptic, which is catastrophic loss. There's a book written exactly around this time by Oswald Spengler, The Decline and Fall of the West. I believe that's what it's called. Or is it just The Decline of the West? There you go. There you go. Written when? This is an abridged version. Is it even going to tell me when it was written? Probably not. Anyway, I don't want to give any help to Amazon. But it's written right after the First World War, after the European powers go into a global conflict, fighting basically in Belgium for 4 years in trenches, thinking that the master, that their nation was going to win very quickly because they have such great technology. The problem is they all develop it at more or less the same time, and you get basically a war of attrition, fought in trenches, in which everyone loses, and huge loss of life ensues. It destroys, I think, without recovery, Christendom. Christendom dies there. Because these are Christian countries who've abandoned their Christian convictions, but they're full of passionate intensity, which they exercise against the others. Now it's not just directed at the colonial enterprise, it's directed within the European powers, the most advanced of which, by this point, culturally was Germany. To this day, I would say, in many ways. The European, the cultural life, the rigor of the German academy is extraordinary, comparatively. But it's chief among the malefactors in the 2 world wars. But this is 1921. It will happen again, right after Yeats' death. Comments or questions? It's an evocative poem. I'm reading a lot into it. I'm reading it out of context. I'm putting it in the context of the course as well. Many famous lines here. The rough beast slouching. The things fall apart. The center cannot hold. The best lack all conviction. The worst are full of passion and intensity. The whole poem is full of memorable phrases, cited by many. But all of it in the context, again, still of Christian language, because that's the way he can orient it. The only way he can understand it. Now he departs from it because he's not a committed Christian. He's not a convicted Christian. He just recognizes the problem with the lack of conviction and could be talking about himself. Again, you're not to expect much of Christian faith from a man who goes to seances. No comments. How do you like the poem? It's very modernist in the sense that it now seems to say a lot, but you're not sure what it's saying. The older poems, where it was quite clear what was being said. even if when it's elusive and evocative, it's pretty clear. Now it's gesturing. It's making a lot of noise. It can be well written. The images can be strong and powerful, but you're not quite sure what's being said. Well, here it's just doom. That's about it. Yeah. I got that. Yes.
It's almost like a sense like he understands the unity that Christianity brought, and there's almost like a feeling of like yearning for that.
Same with Tennyson.
Which it seems.
I yearn for the thing that I don't believe, but I need.
Yeah, and it almost hurts.
Please be true. It's not true. I can't believe it, but please be true, because otherwise we're in ruin.
And it almost hurts to read because it's like you're so close. Like
Yeah.
Like you feel the yearning for it.
Yeah, but how many do you hear in our day that are exactly the same? Like Jordan Peterson right now. I keep hearing he's this close. And yeah. How close is this close? I don't know. I have no idea. But I don't. The fact that you see the need and the meaning and the significance and the power and all of that in this, and yet you see yourself outside of that, and as it being unknowable, and nobody can know, it's an extraordinary statement. It's an expression of despair, not of hope, let alone faith. It's a product of what I call Descartes' cogito, or dubito. It's the whole system is based on doubt. We can't go from doubt to faith. I don't encourage doubt in anybody. I encourage critical thinking, but doubt is not critical thinking. Doubt is just doubt. You can never move from doubt to faith. It's not the way it works. You can reason to faith, but reasoning does not arise in the Enlightenment. Reasoning has a long inheritance going back to the ancient world. And it is, wow, it is brought together. I knew I was reaching a high point when the song burst out. That's okay. The university in medieval times is rooted in the logos and in logic. Right? That's what unites things. Anyway, absolutely. Yes?
So is he even referring to anything when he says the second coming?
It's not clear.
He's just referring to the second coming.
The second coming. Some revelation, surely it's at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out. When a vast image, what is he the image of? He is an image of the Sphinx. And death and ruin and tragedy and fate. And now he's going to refer to the 20th century, vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and now, rather than the baby who is the Savior going to be born, the baby who is like the changeling that took the baby out of there and put a monster in there, that's about to be born, the monster. You know, the myth of the changeling. Some creatures take the baby away and put a little monster in their place. You raise the monster, and there you go. So it's not the second coming of Christ, the doom and gloom. It's the second coming, a monstrous thing is arising. It's the vision of Denethor in the Lord of the Rings, the steward of Gondor. He sees Sauron coming, and he says, against the power that's arisen in the east, there can be no victory. He sees doom. Remember, he's looked into the Palantir, he's seen Sauron, knows he can't win. And he throws himself on a pyre and burns himself alive. Not Tolkien's vision but this is, Yeats represents the European establishment at this point. It largely departs from all hope, all faith, all connection to truth, beauty, and goodness, and embraces as inevitable destruction and doom. And it gives rise to a movement in philosophy called nihilism. Unprecedented historically, but an expression of the mood of the society, a deep despair, which then permeates the academy to this day. Despair. No hope. Three theological virtues: faith, hope, love. They have no faith, they have no hope, they have no love. There you go. Right there. They've got no faith, they've already announced that. They have no hope, we see that. They have no love. Well, look at the eugenics movement. Look at the gas chambers. Look at what ensues. The third poem we're going to look at, it's called Sailing to Byzantium. I wonder if I can blow that up anymore and still get the whole poem. Yeah, sort of works. Anyway, it's called Sailing to Byzantium. I'll have to move it down again. Yeah, this will go up. Remember the film? You may not remember it because it was over a decade ago. No Country for Old Men. Daniel Day-Lewis, interesting Irish actor, at least by background in some ways. Father Cecil Day-Lewis is a famous English poet. When I say Day, I guess it's probably Welsh, combination Welsh-Irish. Day is a Welsh name, Lewis an Irish. But he's talking about Byzantium. What is Byzantium? Byzantium is the Eastern Christendom. It's the center of Eastern Christendom. You associate it with what you associate Eastern Christianity with, which is gold and ornate and a Christendom, a Christian civilization that lasted in the East long after the Western Christendom fell under into ruin. When Rome was sacked by the Vandals and the Goths, eventually the Holy Roman Empire took its place, but Christendom was effectively fractured in the West. In the East, it lived on until it was sacked by and overtaken by the Muslims. But you can see the beautiful, if you go into an Orthodox church to this day, and there's gold inside, and in a sense our chapel reflects a little bit of the Byzantine architecture, but it's associated with, Byzantine is associated with all sorts of things. Beauty is one, the other is confused, hard to, like you think of Byzantine, you think of like a mazy bureaucracy. But it's called Sailing to Byzantium. It's about getting old. It's about, to some degree, about the same thing that Tennyson's Ulysses was about. Remember Tennyson's Ulysses? The end of it? He's defeated the suitors, he's come back, and he's going to go on one last voyage because he will not go die. He will not go meekly into the dark. Rage against the dying of the light. That is no country for old men. The young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations, probably a reference to Keats, at their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl commend all summer long whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of unaging intellect. It's actually through Eastern Christendom that, and the connection of Islam to the West, when they sought to conquer the West, that the mind and the preservation of ancient knowledge was brought into the knowledge of the West again. So the works of Aristotle were preserved in the East where they were lost in the West. And it brought about a sort of a renaissance in the 12th century in Italy, gave rise to Thomas Aquinas and to some degree the European University in that same sense. Very fascinating. But anyway, that reference to the monuments of an aging intellect. So right in the middle of Byzantium, they're unaware of the heritage which they have because they're too busy dying in one another's arms, in passion. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick. Think about Oedipus again. Unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress, nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. And therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. O sages standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall, come from the holy fire, burn in a gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire and fastened to a dying animal, it knows not what it is. And gather me into the artifice of eternity. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past or passing or to come. I can't remember, did I do Keats's odes here in this class? I think I didn't do Keats's odes in the end. Background for this, Keats' ode on a Grecian urn and Ode to a Nightingale, those two odes, very same sorts of meditations on art, eternity, mortality in the backdrop here. Never mind, you don't need them necessarily. The poem stands on itself, but it's clearly a reference obliquely, although not to my mind, who know the poems very well, it's pretty explicit, to those poems by Keats. And about art and about a sort of wise view of life in the light of mortality. And he now connects it even more strongly. Now, Keats has no interest in Christianity whatsoever. Yeats is. For him, it has some sort of significance. But he can't put his finger on it. And he can't even figure on what he is. He calls himself, he's sick with desire and fastened to a dying animal that knows not what it is. What's the dying animal? That's him. It's his body. He's now just a dying animal. That's what Darwin's taught him. He's an animal just like everyone else. He talks about soul clapping its wings. But what is a soul? Nietzsche will dispute that we have such a thing as a soul. It's a Christian doctrine. Marx, likewise, he's a materialist. Freud, same thing. We're not motivated by eternal. There's no sense of relation to God. They're all godless philosophers, atheist humanists in the late 19th, early 20th century. They will dispute the soul. Modern psychology won't acknowledge the soul whatsoever. They'll talk about the brain or the mind, maybe. Not many hold to the mind anymore. It's now all brain. But how about the soul, the eternal aspect of a person that relates to God? Is that even in view? Well, Yeats mentions it at least. Soul, clap its wings, hands, and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. So it's just archaeology. It's not a living way of educating. And that's all he has left. So he goes back to the place where the singing school and the archaeology was at its most beautiful and magnificent, Byzantium. The gold inside the cathedrals. Which can gather him up into eternity. But again, it's not a sense of the kingdom of God. It's not a sense of eternal life. It's a sense of eternal beauty without goodness or truth. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing. So if you don't think that you have a soul, which every religion thinks that we have a soul. Every major religion believes that human beings have something they call a soul, an immortal part of us. Whether you want to say that it's reincarnated or whatever. But the soul, there's something different in people, which the materialist enlightenment denies even exists. We have a mind, but we don't have a soul. It's a reasoning thing. Eventually, it gets rid of all the virtues. Creates men without chests. We're just dying animals, as Yeats puts it, or like men with a stick walking around, like, again, the image of Oedipus. The tragedy, we're fated to this living and dying. Or set upon a golden bough. Golden bough, do you remember the reference? Probably not. In Virgil, the golden bough was what Aeneas had to take a golden bough from the tree to go down to the underworld. That was the only way he was allowed to go down if he could. And he reached up and he got it, and he was allowed to go down into the underworld. It's a portal to go down, but also to come back up. Knowledge. And what knowledge did he get when he went down into the underworld? The knowledge of what the Roman Empire was about to be, and which he, if he fulfilled his quest, would bring about. So he went down a beaten, broken Trojan, and he rose a victorious Roman. And then he went to Italy, and he made it so. So it was a sense of purpose and meaning which was revealed to him in the underworld. The Golden Bough is also a book at this time, by the way, written by a scholar by the name of Sir James Fraser. You can look it up. It's called The Golden Bough, and it's a compendium of pagan mythology. And it sees common features of paganism, common myths, common rites, reverences for things like sacred oaks and sacred ivies and so forth. And this is the legacy of a post-Christian world, or a post-Christian world that has no unifying principle. It's just the images that they see in myths. I get a lot of people talking to me because of my YouTube channel now about the stuff I talk about, and the myths and the images and stuff like that. I'm very interested in this. This is not a new interest. Joseph Campbell writes a book called A Hero with a Thousand Faces. Have you heard of it? And he talks about a common or a monomyth. There's one myth behind all of these old myths in different cultures, and thinks that there's nothing. The one myth is what unifies them all. It's not a Christian view at all. Christian view is that there is in those myths reflections of the true myth, but there is a true myth, and the true myth is in the incarnation and the death and resurrection of Christ. That's the true myth. If you want a story that unites it, there it is. The Hero with a Thousand Faces is they all are the same story with just different faces on them. Contradicts Christian truth. In him all things hold together. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. That's just John's Gospel, John 1, verse 1. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. What did Yeats just say? Things fall apart. Right? In him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body of the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or on heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Tolstoy, in The Death of Ivan Ilyich, talked about the darkness and the light, the rising of the light, but he didn't connect it to the cross of Christ. There's no atonement. There's just an embrace of death. The embrace of death and the meaning of life, which doesn't ignore death, is not a meaningful life. It doesn't lead anywhere, per se. The cross of Christ does lead to life. It's the only life. He's the living one, the one who has life and gives life, eternal life, through his death. That's the connection here. So Yeats here, who laments the loss of the center and sees that things are falling apart, nonetheless will not accept what the Bible and the church has always declared, which is that there is life in him, and there's unity in him, and all things hold together in him. That's what the university's there to do. That's what I'm here to do in this class, is to speak of that. It's a magnificent vocation. And I will also say that in my other class, people talked about the reality of evil and the imminence of evil, which Yeats himself catalogs in The Second Coming, that sense of doom. But the greater sense is that of life. It's just like when you experience evil, it hits you in the face, and you can't deny it. When you get hit in the face, or you experience a terrible accident, or death, or disease, whatever, it seems like there's nothing else. That's all you can see. All you can sense. But the gospel declares that that's not the real thing. The real thing is God. The ultimate reality, and even now the reality, and a Christian university builds on that reality and declares it. The darkness is not real. The light is real. Anyway, done for today.